The curse of Nessa. Nessa had always lived life her way with little regard for others. Sharp-tongued and unapologetic, she reveled in belittling those around her, from her co-workers to strangers on the street. She was the type to cut in line, scoff at people struggling with heavy bags, and take pleasure in her sharp, biting remarks. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when her life began to change. Nessa was on her way home from work, umbrella tilted against the downpour, when she saw the old woman. She was crossing the street, hunched over and struggling with a heavy paper bag of groceries. Nessa barely spared her a glance until the inevitable happened. The bag ripped, spilling oranges, cans, and loaves of bread across the wet pavement. The old woman dropped to her knees, trying to gather the items as cars honked impatiently. Nessa stopped on the curb, watching. Instead of helping, she let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You should have used a better bag, Grandma," she sneered, walking away. The old woman froze, her weathered face darkening with anger. "You think you're untouchable," she called after Nessa, her voice shaking with emotion. "One day you'll remember this moment. One day you'll face something so terrible, and you'll wish you had been kinder. I curse you." Nessa turned back, amused. "Sure, lady. Good luck with that." She continued walking, the woman's words already fading from her mind. That night, the nightmares began. At first, they were vague. A sense of falling, darkness closing in, and the feeling of being watched. Nessa woke in a cold sweat, dismissing it as stress from work. But the next night was worse. She dreamed of the old woman standing at the foot of her bed, her eyes black as coal. "You laughed," the woman whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Now, you'll cry." Nessa jolted awake, her heart racing. She glanced around the room, her breath hitching. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. She turned on every light in her apartment, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Over the next few days, her life spiraled. At work, she began hearing whispers. At first, she thought it was her co-workers gossiping, but when she turned, no one was there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, saying things like, "You're next," and "She's coming." Objects in her apartment moved on their own. She'd place her phone on the counter, only to find it on the floor moments later. Her bathroom mirror cracked without explanation, the shards reflecting distorted images of her own terrified face. And then there were the ghosts. It started with fleeting glimpses, shadows darting past her peripheral vision, faint figures standing in doorways. One night, as she brushed her teeth, she saw someone in the mirror behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there. A woman with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth, reaching for her. Nessa screamed, stumbling backward and knocking over a lamp. She tried to ignore it, but the nightmares continued to worsen. The old woman appeared in them again and again, her voice growing louder each time. "You'll learn," she said. "You'll know what it's like to feel helpless." One night, Nessa woke to the sound of her door creaking open. She froze, her heart pounding. The room was pitch black, but she could hear the faint sound of footsteps approaching her bed. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. No one answered. The footsteps stopped, but the air grew colder. She reached for her bedside lamp, her hand shaking, but when she turned it on, the light flickered and went out. In the darkness, she felt a hand brush against her arm. By now, Nessa was unraveling. She barely slept, her once sharp appearance replaced by dark circles and a haunted expression. She tried to confide in friends, but they dismissed her as paranoid or attention-seeking. One evening, desperate for answers, she decided to search for the old woman. She retraced her steps to the street where she'd first seen her, but found no sign of her. She asked shopkeepers and passers-by, but no one remembered seeing an old woman that fit her description. Feeling defeated, Nessa returned home. But as she walked through her front door, She saw something that made her blood run cold. Her reflection in the hallway mirror wasn't her own. Instead, it was the old woman, her face twisted into a sinister grin. "You can't escape," the reflection said, though Nessa's lips didn't move. "You'll suffer as others have suffered because of you." Nessa screamed and shattered the mirror with her fist, the glass splintering into hundreds of pieces. The hauntings grew worse. Nessa's apartment became a nightmare of shifting shadows and disembodied voices. Her belongings were tossed around, her walls scratched with words like "apologize" and "pay." The old woman's face appeared everywhere, in the windows, on her TV screen, even in the reflections of her spoons. Unable to bear it any longer, Nessa broke down. "What do you want from me?" she cried into the darkness of her apartment. For the first time, the whispers stopped. The air grew still, and then a voice echoed through the room, the old woman's voice. "Repent." Desperate to end her torment, Nessa decided to make amends. She started by apologizing to her co-workers for her rude behavior. She helped strangers on the street, donated to charity, and went out of her way to be kind to everyone she met. But the hauntings didn't stop. One night, as she lay in bed, exhausted and defeated, the old woman appeared at the foot of her bed. Not a ghostly figure, but solid and real. "Please," Nessa begged, tears streaming down her face. "I've changed. I'm sorry." The old woman's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained cold. "It's not enough," she said. "You must truly understand what it feels like." The room dissolved into darkness, and Nessa found herself standing in the middle of a busy street, invisible to those around her. She watched as people laughed and mocked a younger version of herself, struggling with groceries that spilled onto the road. The old woman's voice echoed around her. "Do you feel it now? The helplessness, the shame." "Yes," Nessa whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I feel it. I'm sorry. Please, stop this." When Nessa woke, the hauntings were gone. Her apartment was still, her reflection normal. But she was changed. From that day on, she lived with a deep understanding of the pain she had caused others. The old woman's curse had lifted, but the lesson remained etched into her soul, a constant reminder that kindness was not just a choice, it was a necessity.